In the summer of 1899, men at Nome discovered gold lying in the beach sand beneath their boots. No claim was required. By the next summer, as many as 20,000 fortune seekers had crowded onto the treeless shore. By autumn, the United States Army was rescuing hundreds too poor to survive the winter. The gold was real. So was the ruin. This was the beginning of America's wickedest Arctic boomtown. Long before anyone called it Nome, the shore had another name, Sitnasuak. It lay where the Snake River loosened into Norton Sound, between the gray water of the Bering Sea and a low sweep of tundra rising toward the hills. There were no forests to break the wind. In summer, the ground softened beneath mats of grass and moss, and mosquitoes lifted from the wet country in dark clouds. In winter, ice covered the sound, snow flattened the colors, and the coast seemed to narrow into three things: white ground, white sky, and the dark line where one met the other. To strangers arriving later, this would look like emptiness. It was not. Inupiat families had hunted, fished, gathered, traded, and camped along this coast for generations beyond written record. The sea provided seals, walrus, fish, and birds. Rivers opened paths inland toward caribou country. Movement followed the animals, the weather, and the ice. A place useful in July might be dangerous in October. A route open to boats in summer could become a road for sleds in winter. Survival depended less on possessing one fixed piece of ground than on knowing when each part of the country could be used. That knowledge left marks, though many remained underground. In 2005 and 2006, construction crews working to improve Nome's harbor uncovered the remains of two semi-subterranean houses near the mouth of the Snake River. Beside them lay a midden containing pottery, tools, carvings, and animal bones. The site dated to around 1700, more than 2 centuries after the gold rush. Engineers cutting into the earth for a modern harbor had exposed evidence that people were living there nearly 2 centuries before the first prospectors drove stakes into Anvil Creek. The discovery confirmed in soil what the name Sitnasuak had already preserved in memory. Nome had not appeared from nothing in 1898. It had been built over another place. Nor was that place isolated in the way outsiders would later imagine. For more than 2,000 years, trade networks connected the Inupiat of northwestern Alaska with communities across the peninsula, the interior, and the Bering Strait. At the great seasonal trade fair at Sisualik, farther north, as many as 22 nations might gather in a single year. At its height, perhaps 2,000 people arrived with hides, tools, food, ivory, and news. Traders came from the North Slope and the Yukon interior, from south of the Seward Peninsula, and from Siberia across the water. That number is worth pausing over. Before Nome had a saloon, a courthouse, or an English name, gatherings elsewhere in this supposedly remote region could rival the population of many established American towns. If you had stood at the mouth of the Snake River then, the landscape would not have explained itself quickly. There were no brick warehouses to announce commerce and no permanent wharf to measure traffic. The evidence moved. Boats appeared and vanished. Sled runners crossed old snow. Fish dried in coastal camps. Goods passed from one family to another, sometimes traveling hundreds of miles without entering a building or appearing in an account book. The first outside empires reached the region through the same water. Russian traders established a fortified post at St. Michael in 1833, more than 100 miles southeast across Norton Sound. The United States purchased Alaska from Russia in 1867, changing the flag over distant government buildings, but not the daily requirements of the coast. Ice still determined travel. Animals still determined food. A person who misread either could die before any government learned his name. Commercial ships brought new goods and new pressures. Fur traders and whalers entered northern waters in growing numbers. Missionaries followed, carrying school books, church doctrine, and firm ideas about how native people should live. The old trade routes remained, but their balance shifted. Outside merchants drew commerce toward ships and posts. Missionaries preached against ceremonies and dances that had accompanied native gatherings for generations. Alongside cloth, metal tools, flour, and tea came disease, and a cash economy that valued an animal differently once its hide or ivory could be sold elsewhere. By the early 1890s, Presbyterian missionary and federal education official Sheldon Jackson was promoting another imported answer to northern hardship. Domestic reindeer would be brought from Siberia and placed under government and mission supervision. The stated purpose was to create a dependable source of food and employment for native communities after wild game had declined. The program also carried a second ambition: to replace movement through the old hunting country with an industry that officials could count, manage, and direct. The first government reindeer station opened at Teller in 1892. Reindeer arrived across the Bering Strait, followed by Sami herders recruited for their knowledge of the animals. Corrals, contracts, apprenticeships, and mission rules entered a landscape previously ordered by migration and season. One of the men drawn north by that program was a 23-year-old Norwegian named Japhet Lindeberg. He signed a reindeer herding contract in January 1898 and traveled to Alaska with no public reputation and no known fortune. He had crossed an ocean to tend animals, not to found a city. Beyond the coast, the Snake River divided into smaller streams. One of them ran below a mountain marked by a dark, anvil-shaped formation near its summit. Water had been moving through those hills for ages, carrying minute pieces of stone downstream and sorting the heavier particles into gravel. Lindeberg had not come looking for what lay there. Not yet. The name came later. The Three Lucky Swedes. It sounded like the title of a frontier fable, tidy enough to print beneath a photograph. In truth, only two of the men were Swedish. Japhet Lindeberg was Norwegian. None of them had arrived on the Seward Peninsula as an accomplished gold miner. John Bryntesen had worked as a coal miner. Eric Lindblom had been a tailor. Lindeberg had crossed the Atlantic under contract to herd reindeer. Their partnership began not with destiny, but overcrowding. By the summer of 1898, several hundred prospectors had gathered around Council City, an inland mining camp east of the future Nome. Gold had already been found on tributaries of the Nukluk River. Men arrived, drove stakes into the ground, and claimed the surrounding country through notices, boundary markers, and powers of attorney. According to Lindeberg, the district had been staked all the way to the mountaintops. He met Bryntesen and Lindblom there by chance in August. They had little reason to trust one another beyond a shared dissatisfaction with the ground still available. The best claims appeared taken. Remaining in council meant working for someone else, buying into doubtful property, or searching land that hundreds of men had already examined. The three chose to leave. They traveled to Golovin Bay and obtained a large open boat. On September 11th, they loaded provisions and started along the coast, stopping at river mouths to test gravel. The boat offered no cabin and little protection from the weather. Everything they needed had to travel with them: food, blankets, tools, and enough fuel to make the journey useful. They were moving north and west toward Port Clarence, but the route was not fixed. Every stream offered a reason to stop. They found traces of gold, but not enough to justify staying. Eventually, they reached the mouth of the Snake River. From the coast, the river wound into a broad valley beneath low mountains. They followed it inland and camped near Glacier Creek. The country gave no outward sign of what it held. Muck and clay covered beds of gravel, beneath that lay pale gray micaceous schist, stone that broke with a silvery surface. Gold had settled through the gravel and lodged in cracks near the top of the bedrock, hidden beneath soil, roots, and cold water. The men began testing the tributaries. They named the creeks as they worked: Glacier Creek, Rock Creek, Dry Creek. Snow Gulch. One stream ran beneath a mountain bearing a dark formation shaped like a blacksmith's anvil. They called the stream Anvil Creek. Their methods were simple. Gravel went into a pan with water. The lighter material washed over the edge as the pan was tilted and turned. What remained at the bottom grew darker and heavier. A few yellow particles were encouraging. A concentrated line of them meant the ground might pay. On these creeks, the yellow remained. The dates do not fit together perfectly. The National Park Service places the major Anvil Creek discovery on September 20, 1898. One history of the federal courts gives September 21. The surviving Cape Nome Mining District record lists a Lindblom claim on Mountain Creek on September 19, a Snow Creek claim on September 20, and the joint discovery claim on Anvil Creek on September 22. Even the people who were there could not later agree on every detail. On the first day of 1900, the Nome Nugget published an article titled, "Who Discovered Nome?" The newspaper presented conflicting versions and left the matter to future historians. Future historians inherited the disagreement. What is certain is that the three men found payable gold on several tributaries and judged Anvil Creek the best of them. They marked a discovery claim in their joint names, then each staked additional ground individually. Wooden posts and paper notices transformed pieces of tundra into property. The gold had been carried and sorted by water over ages. Ownership took an afternoon. That transformation is worth examining closely. Anvil Creek ran for roughly 6 miles, but only about half of its bed appeared to contain profitable gravel. A typical placer claim measured approximately 660 feet across and 1,320 feet along the stream. 12 such claims could cover nearly the entire rich section. A dozen rectangles. That was enough to divide most of the prize. The men understood the danger of news. They tried to keep the discovery quiet while securing the claims and organizing a mining district. They brought in several trusted men, including Norwegian miner Hans Kittelsen, Sami prospector Johan Tornensis, and Gabe Price. On October 15, 1898, they formed the Cape Nome Mining District. Rules, record books, and a district recorder followed the stakes. For the moment, the system belonged to the people already present. But the title Three Lucky Swedes carried a second meaning in the mouths of those arriving too late. Bryntesen and Lindblom had become naturalized United States citizens. Lindeberg had formally declared his intention to become one at St. Michael on July 22, before the discovery. Under federal mining law, citizens and those who had declared their intention to become citizens could locate claims on public land. The paperwork was valid. Resentment did not require it to be invalid. Other prospectors began describing the Scandinavians as foreigners who had seized American ground. Earlier arrivals used powers of attorney to stake claims for absent associates, concentrating still more land among a small circle. By the end of December, approximately 300 claims had been recorded in the district. 4 months later, there would be 1,200. By July 1899, there would be 2,000, many resting on little more than paper, ambition, and overlapping boundary lines. The three men had found a fortune. They had also created a shortage. During the winter, word moved outward while the Bering Sea froze the district in place. Reports traveled through mining camps, trading posts, and Pacific ports. Men began preparing for the spring journey before they had seen a single grain of Nome gold. When they arrived, they would find the profitable creeks crossed with stakes and crowded with names. Below them, the Bering Sea continued pushing waves across a strip of sand that no one had yet thought worth owning. By July 1899, the mining camp at Nome stood close to violence. Approximately 3,000 people had gathered around the Snake River and its tributaries. Many had arrived after the valuable ground was taken. They could see gold coming out of Anvil Creek, but wooden stakes and paper notices stood between them and the gravel. Men challenged boundaries, questioned citizenship papers, and filed new claims directly over old ones. At one point, the United States Army had to restrain a crowd preparing to declare every existing claim invalid and reopen the creeks for staking. Then someone looked down at the beach. No reliable record preserves the first discovery. Several people later claimed credit, and several may have noticed the gold independently. Some accounts name individual prospectors. Others place the discovery at different points along the coast. The surviving evidence allows only a broader certainty. During the summer of 1899, men began finding significant quantities of gold in the sand beside the Bering Sea. It was not hidden in a mountain or buried beneath frozen gravel. It lay in a dark streak running through an ordinary beach. The gold had traveled gradually. Streams carried particles out of the hills. Waves cut into the coastal plain, separated lighter sand from heavier material, and concentrated the gold near the waterline. Each piece was small, often fine enough to resemble dust. But there was a great deal of sand, and the sea had been sorting it long before anyone arrived with a shovel. For the frustrated men at Nome, the location mattered as much as the metal. A creek claim could be marked, recorded, defended, sold, or stolen. The beach could not be divided in the same way. It remained open ground. A man did not need permission from the three lucky Swedes. He did not need to buy shares in a mining company or persuade a claim owner to hire him. He needed a shovel, a bucket, water, and some means of separating heavy gold from lighter sand. The result was gold without a fence. Men dug into the narrow pay streak and carried the sand to wooden rockers. A rocker resembled a crude box mounted, so it could be tipped from side to side. Sand and gravel went into the top. Water washed the lighter material through, while riffles trapped the heavier particles below. The machine could be built from lumber, operated by hand, and moved when one patch of beach stopped paying. Nothing about the work was effortless. Shovels grew heavy, cold water numbed hands, wind drove sand against faces and into clothing. Every bucket had to be lifted, carried, washed, and discarded, but there was no shaft to sink and no deep layer of frozen ground to thaw. A person could begin in the morning and know by evening whether the beach would feed him. The camp called it the poor man's paradise. By autumn, the beach had become an outdoor factory with no walls. Sam Dunham, reporting for the United States Department of Labor, saw double lines of men working for miles, nearly shoulder to shoulder. Some stripped away the upper sand to expose the darker pay streak. Others supplied water and dirt to the rockers. The wooden boxes knocked and scraped in uneven rhythm. Men joked or sang while they worked, occasionally looking west toward clouds building over the Bering Sea. More than 1,000 beach miners extracted about $1 million in gold during the fall of 1899. The image is more useful than the total. A fortune large enough to finance buildings, businesses, and steamship voyages came from men kneeling beside hand-built boxes on an exposed strip of sand. For a time, the beach relieved the pressure on the creeks. Men who had been ready to tear out claim stakes now had somewhere else to dig. The arrangement appeared almost democratic. The waterline ignored citizenship, seniority, and paperwork. A tailor could work beside a former clerk. A laborer with a borrowed shovel could stand a few yards from a millionaire's property and recover gold from the same coastal plain. But the equality of the beach had a narrow foundation. The richest sand went first. Some miners believed the sea would replace the gold. They imagined each tide carrying new particles ashore like driftwood, renewing the pay streak after every storm. It was a useful belief in a place already crowded with useful beliefs. The beach deposits were finite. Waves had concentrated them slowly, and 1,000 men with shovels could remove them much faster than the coast could create them. The distinction mattered little once the story left Nome. Reports traveling south did not describe a thinning pay streak or the number of men who found nothing. They described gold lying loose on a public beach. In Dawson, thousands of stampeders were still working odd jobs or laboring for men who owned the Klondike claims. Many had crossed mountain passes carrying nearly a ton of supplies, only to discover that the richest Yukon ground had been claimed before they arrived. Nome offered a second chance without the mountain. During the summer of 1899, more than 8,000 people abandoned Dawson for the new strike. They boarded steamers traveling down the Yukon toward St. Michael and Norton Sound. Some carried mining equipment. Others brought printing presses, liquor, merchandise, or professional skills that had no direct connection to gold. A person did not have to believe he would find a fortune if he believed the people looking for one would need food, lodging, tools, and entertainment. The beach accomplished what Anvil Creek alone could not. The creek claims were richer, but they belonged to a small group. The beach belonged, at least in imagination, to everyone. That difference turned a regional mining strike into an international invitation. During the winter of 1899 and 1900, the invitation spread through newspapers, shipping offices, railway stations, and waterfront saloons. Steamship companies announced passages from Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco. Outfitters assembled Arctic clothing, tents, stoves, shovels, and rockers. Men sold farms, left jobs, or borrowed money against homes they expected to buy back with gold. They prepared to land on a shore where wealth could be gathered from beneath their boots. By the time their ships reached Nome, much of the richest surface sand would already be gone. The people were still coming. The ships came as far as Nome and stopped. There was no deep harbor waiting for them, no protected basin, no line of wharves reaching into navigable water. The mouth of the Snake River was shallow, and the open coast offered little shelter from the Bering Sea. Large steamships had to anchor offshore, their dark hulls visible beyond the surf, while wind and waves decided how quickly anything could be brought ashore. Passengers climbed down into smaller boats and barges known as lighters. Their belongings followed in separate loads: barrels, crates, tents, stoves, tools, mining machinery, sacks of food, and stacks of finished lumber moved from ship to lighter, then from lighter to wet sand. A calm landing was exhausting. In rough water, cargo shifted, boats struck the bottom, and men standing in the surf tried to keep boxes from floating away. Nearly everything required to build Nome arrived by that method. The gold was local. The city was imported piece by piece. During the early summer of 1900, steamships from Seattle, Portland, and San Francisco appeared one after another in the roadstead. Some carried experienced miners from other northern camps. Others brought clerks, cooks, carpenters, lawyers, merchants, gamblers, laborers, newspaper men, and people with no clear trade beyond their willingness to leave home. Women arrived as business owners, entertainers, nurses, cooks, wives, and prospectors. Many passengers had purchased complete outfits assembled by Southern merchants who knew almost as little about Nome as their customers did. They stepped ashore expecting a gold field and found a beach covered with freight. Piles of lumber stood beside cooking stoves, trunks, canvas rolls, mining rockers, and food intended to last until the sea closed. Owners searched for their goods among thousands of nearly identical boxes. Some discovered that essential equipment had been loaded on another vessel. Others found broken crates or water-soaked supplies. A person could reach Nome before his tent, his stove, or the tools on which his livelihood depended. There was no warehouse system large enough to impose order. The beach became dock, freight yard, campsite, workshop, and mine at the same time. Men dragged possessions above the tide line, drove stakes into the sand, and raised canvas wherever space remained. Behind them, other men continued digging through the same shore for gold. The first Nome was built from cloth, Rows of tents spread along the coast and onto the damp ground beyond it. Some were sleeping quarters with blankets laid over boards. Others became restaurants, stores, hotels, offices, laundries, medical rooms, or drinking establishments. A painted sign and a counter could turn canvas into a business before the next ship arrived. The distinction between temporary shelter and commercial property depended largely on what happened inside. Wooden buildings followed as quickly as lumber could be landed and carpenters could assemble it. Nome had no forest from which to cut construction timber. Boards, beams, windows, doors, nails, roofing, and decorative trim came north by ship. The buildings reproduced forms familiar from mining towns farther south: narrow fronts, rectangular rooms, false facades, and upper floors divided into rented chambers. There had been no time to study how these forms would behave on wet tundra beside an exposed northern sea. Front Street took shape parallel to the beach, close enough that the sound of surf carried behind its walls. Stedman Street ran inland from it. Between the buildings, feet and wagon wheels worked the softened ground into mud. Wooden planks were laid down to create walkways above the muck. More boards became counters, floors, bunks, doors, signs, and shelves. Nome consumed lumber almost as quickly as its miners processed sand. The city developed in layers. Canvas gave way to rough boards. Rough boards acquired false fronts. A tent restaurant might become a one-story frame building, then add rented rooms above it. Businesses changed owners, names, and purposes while the paint was still fresh. Nothing required a long history. A building became old by surviving one winter. The population was as difficult to measure as the city itself. Estimates claimed that as many as 20,000 people landed at Nome during the Great Rush. The United States Census of 1900 recorded 12,488 residents, making Nome the largest community in Alaska. The two figures describe different things. One counts a shifting summer invasion. The other attempts to fix that movement on a page. People arrived, departed, moved to outlying creeks, lived aboard vessels, or returned south before the freeze. Nome could gain or lose the population of a small town between steamship sailings. The post office revealed the problem in paper form. During the summer of 1900, Nome became the largest general delivery address in the entire United States postal system. Most newcomers had no permanent street address. Their letters accumulated under surnames in filing boxes. Postal clerks reportedly needed 5 boxes for people named Johnson alone, 5 boxes for one surname, in a city that had barely existed 2 years earlier. Mail, freight, and people continued entering faster than anyone could sort them. The makeshift local government lacked the money and authority to provide adequate sanitation or essential services for the crowd. There was no complete system for clean water, waste, fire protection, housing, or policing. Rules were improvised by committees, military officers, federal officials, and whoever could make others obey them. The physical arrangement sharpened every difficulty. Thousands of people occupied a low strip between cold water and wet tundra. Supplies came through one exposed shoreline. Winter could close that shoreline for months. A damaged shipment, an early freeze, or a severe storm could turn inconvenience into hunger. Yet in summer, Nome gave the appearance of permanence. Telegraph wire and electric lines appeared. Wooden walks crossed mud that had been bare tundra the year before. Hotels advertised rooms. Newspapers printed daily editions. Warehouses and stores bulged with goods brought through the surf. Front Street displayed the familiar face of an American city, though the structures behind that face still smelled of new-cut lumber and damp canvas. By daylight, the beach remained crowded with miners, freight handlers, and builders. After dark, the movement shifted toward the lamps along Front Street. Nome had been unloaded, assembled, and counted. Now its brightest doors stayed open through the night. At night, Front Street glowed against the tundra. Light spilled from windows onto plank walkways and mud. Music, shouting, and the hard clatter of gambling tables carried between buildings. Men came in from the beach with black sand in their clothes and gold dust folded into paper packets. Others arrived from the creeks after weeks of cold water, wet boots, and repetitive labor. Inside, they found whiskey, cards, warmth, and people willing to help separate them from whatever the ground had paid. Nome had more than 50 saloons by the height of the rush. Some were little more than canvas tents with bottles behind a board. Others had polished counters, mirrors, gambling rooms, and private chambers upstairs. They sold drinks, but the drink was only part of the business. A saloon might serve as an employment office, meeting room, theater, bank, information exchange, and refuge from the wind. Claims were discussed over cards. Partnerships began and ended at the bar. A miner could buy a meal. Here Witch Creek was paying. Arrange transport, lose his savings, and find a bed without leaving the building. The most famous belonged to Wyatt Earp and his partner Charles Hoxie. Earp reached Nome with a reputation already formed thousands of miles away. In Tombstone, Arizona, he had been a lawman and participant in the gunfight near the OK Corral. In Nome, he did not arrive wearing a badge. He came as a businessman who understood what happened when large numbers of men carrying cash entered a town with few established pleasures. The Dexter Saloon, built in 1899, was credited as Nome's first two-story wooden building. The choice of structure said something about the order in which the town acquired permanence. Nome built a saloon upward before it built a courthouse. The Dexter advertised itself as the only second-class saloon in Alaska, a joke that depended on everyone knowing it was among the finest. Its size and furnishings distinguished it from the canvas drinking rooms around it. Earp was not mining the beach. He was occupying the place where successful miners came after the cleanup. Other establishments competed through music, gambling, women, brighter lamps, and longer hours. Faro, roulette, poker, and dice converted gold into motion. A man might begin with dust weighed on a scale and finish with nothing but the price of breakfast. Dealers and proprietors could earn money without touching a shovel, provided that miners continued believing the next pan would replace what they lost. Prostitution occupied rooms above and behind the commercial streets. Some women worked through dance halls or saloons. Others rented small rooms and operated independently. Their presence was neither incidental nor hidden. Nome had been built around a population that was heavily male, transient, and often separated from home by months of travel. The same economy that placed a premium on lumber, fresh food, and winter shelter placed one on companionship. But Front Street was not only vice arranged beneath false fronts. Printers unloaded presses and began publishing newspapers while the city was still mostly canvas. The Nome Nugget appeared in 1899, followed by competing papers that printed shipping schedules, mining notices, advertisements, political arguments, and accusations of fraud. Religious services were organized in tents and temporary rooms. Doctors treated injuries from machinery, exposure, contaminated water, and crowded living conditions. A quarantine station outside town held smallpox patients away from the main camp. Women operated restaurants, laundries, lodging houses, shops, and medical rooms. Families lived a few streets inland from the saloons. Washing hung beside tents. Children moved through a city designed by adults who had not expected children to be present. A miner might leave an all-night gambling room and pass a prayer meeting, a bakery beginning its morning work, and a woman carrying water before reaching the beach. The contradictions stood close together because there was nowhere else to put them. Nome earned a reputation for theft, drunkenness, prostitution, and violence. One account in 1900 called it the wickedest city in the United States. The phrase traveled well. It gave newspaper readers in distant cities exactly the Nome they expected. a northern Babylon built from gold dust and appetite. The daily reality was less orderly than the legend and less theatrical. Most disputes did not end in gunfire. Most nights did not produce a corpse. Men worked, ate, repaired equipment, waited for mail, and worried about winter. Yet the possibility of violence remained near the surface because property records overlapped, law enforcement was thin, and nearly every argument involved something that could be weighed in gold. Claim jumping caused the most dangerous confrontations. Armed men guarded equipment and boundary posts. Rival owners carried competing papers for the same ground. Soldiers could separate two groups at a creek, but they could not decide which filing was legal. That required courts, judges, marshals, and a body of law suited to a place that had grown faster than its government. The city's makeshift consent government could issue rules, but lacked the resources to provide adequate sanitation, policing, and relief. The Army gradually assumed greater responsibility. Fort Davis was established several miles east of Nome in 1900, close enough for troops to enter the city when crowds threatened property or public order. Their most persistent enemy was not crime. It was the calendar. Many newcomers had brought enough food for summer and no shelter suitable for winter. They expected to find gold quickly or earn passage south before the final ships departed. When neither happened, they became stranded between a freezing sea and a city that could not feed them. Prices rose as supplies diminished. Tents that had been tolerable beneath summer light became cold, damp chambers as temperatures fell. The government established a camp near the Nome River for destitute men. Hundreds eventually required assistance from the Army. Residents without adequate shelter or money to survive were pressed to leave, while steamships could still carry them south. The population began pouring away in September, the same beach that had received the rush now serving as its exit. Still, those who remained wanted something the Army could not provide. They wanted a court capable of settling ownership, punishing fraud, and making investment safe. Congress had passed a new civil code for Alaska and created additional judicial districts. Nome would finally receive a federal judge of its own. In July 1900, Judge Arthur Noyes arrived aboard ship with court officers, attorneys, and the promise of lawful order. Traveling with him was a North Dakota political boss named Alexander Mackenzie. Alexander Mackenzie went ashore before the judge did. The steamer Senator reached Nome on July 19, 1900, carrying Mackenzie, Arthur Noyes, and Robert Chips, one of the men challenging Japhet Lindbergh's ownership of the discovery claim. Noyes remained aboard for 2 more days. Mackenzie used the interval to visit the law firm representing the claim jumpers and consolidate control over their lawsuits. He had not come north merely to advise them. Mackenzie was a Republican political boss with influence in Minnesota and the Dakotas. He had formed the Alaska Gold Mining Company with a stated capitalization of $15 million. The company acquired disputed titles from claim jumpers in exchange for stock. Mackenzie kept the controlling interest. If the courts recognized those titles, paper shares created in Washington would become ownership of the richest ground on Anvil Creek. His first plan had been legislative. Allies in the United States Senate attempted to alter Alaska's new civil code in a way that could have invalidated claims held by foreign-born miners. The effort failed. Mackenzie then used his political influence to secure Noyes' appointment as federal judge for the judicial division containing Nome. The new court was the second plan. On July 23, 2 days after Noyes stepped ashore, attorneys working with Mackenzie presented papers asking the judge to appoint a receiver over several disputed mines. A receiver was supposed to be a neutral caretaker. When ownership of valuable property remained uncertain, the court could place that property under temporary supervision so neither side could damage or remove it before a judgment. The proper way to preserve a gold mine was to stop the mining. Noyes did the opposite. When an attorney began reading the affidavit supporting the request, the judge stopped him. Noyes said a full reading was unnecessary. He then appointed Mackenzie himself as receiver and authorized him to take immediate possession of the claims, operate them, and hold the gold until the court decided who owned it. The proceeding was irregular from the beginning. Noyes had missed the legally scheduled court term at St. Michael. He had not given the 30 days of public notice required before holding a special term elsewhere. The court had not been properly organized. The owners of the mines had not been given an opportunity to answer the request. Mackenzie had already prepared the wagons. While the attorneys assembled papers, he had gathered teams and men to move on Anvil Creek. Within minutes of receiving the appointment, and before the documents had been filed with the court clerk, Mackenzie was traveling toward the mines with an official order in his possession. The miners learned that their property had entered receivership when Mackenzie arrived to take it. At first, the order covered the claims and mining operations. When lawyers for the original owners objected, Noyes expanded it. Mackenzie was authorized to seize the sluice boxes, pumps, pipe, machinery, excavations, boarding houses, tents, buildings, scales, safes, money, gold dust, and other personal property on the claims. The court had not merely taken the mine. It had taken the miners' shelter, tools, records, and the gold they had already recovered. Noyes then left for St. Michael. He promised to rule on a motion challenging the receivership when he returned. The date passed. When he finally acted, he denied the owner's request to remove Mackenzie. He also denied their effort to appeal. Meanwhile, the receiver continued mining. Noyes required a bond of $5,000 for each claim placed in Mackenzie's hands. At that moment, the discovery claim was producing approximately $15,000 in gold dust each day. The security intended to protect the owners was worth only a few hours of production. By mid-September, Mackenzie's men had accumulated approximately $130,000 in ore. He was also accused of confiscating more than $200,000 in gold dust belonging to the original owners. The mine was being emptied while its ownership was supposedly being preserved. Lawyers for the Pioneer and Wild Goose Companies turned to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. Judge William Morrow reviewed the record and issued emergency orders directing Mackenzie to return the mines, gold, and personal property. The orders traveled north much more slowly than gold moved out of gravel. When they reached Nome, Mackenzie refused to comply. Noyes declined to enforce them, claiming that the matter had passed beyond his control. Miners from the Pioneer and Wild Goose Companies threatened to carry out the appellate order themselves. Soldiers arrived at Anvil Creek before the confrontation became a gunfight. The Ninth Circuit sent 2 federal marshals north with authority to arrest Mackenzie for contempt. They reached Nome as autumn narrowed the remaining travel season. On October 15, they took him into custody and discovered that more than $200,000 in gold dust was being held at the Alaska Banking and Safe Depots Company. Mackenzie refused to surrender the vault keys and threatened violence. With military assistance, the marshals forced open the vaults, removed the gold, and returned it to the original owners. They then carried Mackenzie south to California. Nome celebrated his arrest. The man who had arrived as a political power left as a prisoner. In February 1901, the Ninth Circuit sentenced him to 1 year in the Alameda County Jail. The Supreme Court quickly upheld the sentence. Mackenzie's allies then turned to President William McKinley, who commuted the term on grounds of poor health. Mackenzie served a little more than 3 months. The case against Judge Noyes took longer. In January 1902, the Ninth Circuit found him guilty of contempt for refusing to enforce its orders. Evidence pointed strongly toward a conspiracy to use the court for private gain. though the proceeding dealt narrowly with contempt rather than the larger theft. 2 judges imposed a fine of $1,000. A third wanted Noyes imprisoned for 18 months, but believed the court lacked the power to do so. Mackenzie had accumulated $130,000 in ore under Noyes' authority. Noyes paid $1,000. The numbers belonged to the same case. The mines eventually returned to their owners, but confidence in Nome's courts and property records had been damaged. Capital waited. Construction slowed. Mining activity remained tangled in litigation long after Mackenzie left the vault. When the pumps and sluice boxes on Anvil Creek began moving steadily again, the lesson was visible in the equipment. A wooden claim stake could identify rich ground. It could no longer defend or fully exploit it. For that, Nome would need companies, railroads, lawyers, and machines. The shovel did not disappear from Nome. It simply stopped being enough. In the first seasons, a miner could work with tools he understood immediately. A shovel lifted gravel. A bucket carried it. A rocker or sluice box let water separate the gold. The equipment was cheap enough to own, small enough to move, and simple enough to repair with lumber and nails. That system depended on rich ground near the surface. By the summer of 1900, most of the easiest beach gold had already been removed. The pay streak that created the rush had been narrow, and the first 1,000 miners had reached it before the 20,000 newcomers arrived. Gold remained in the sand, but increasingly in quantities too small to reward a man processing 1 bucket at a time. The beach began acquiring hoses, pumps, and small engines. Water could now be moved to the sand rather than carried in buckets. Larger sluice systems handled more material. Crews divided the labor among digging, feeding, washing, and cleaning the boxes. The equipment increased production, but it also increased the cost of beginning. A miner without money had to rent machinery, work for someone who owned it, or move to ground the machines had not yet reached. The same change occurred more dramatically on the creeks. Gold at Anvil Creek lay beneath muck, clay, gravel, and frozen ground. In the early years, men used fire or steam to soften the earth. They sank shafts during winter, thawed sections of gravel, and piled the material where it froze again. When warm weather returned, the winter dump could be washed through sluices. It was slow work measured in feet. Companies began measuring the same ground in cubic yards. Charles D. Lane had purchased several disputed claims for a reported $300,000 rather than attempting to jump them. His Wild Goose Mining and Trading Company brought equipment north, established shipping connections, and built warehouses. In 1900, the company began laying a narrow-gauge railroad from Nome toward the mines at Anvil City. The rails carried the weight that had defeated individual prospectors. Boilers, pumps, pipe, lumber, food, and heavy machinery could move inland from the beach without being dragged across miles of wet tundra. Gold traveled back toward Nome. The trains operated during the open season, while winter closed the line beneath snow and cold. Their schedule followed the same northern calendar as the miners, but their capacity belonged to an industrial economy. A man with a rocker could move when his patch stopped paying. A company with railroad track, warehouses, and boilers had to make the entire landscape feed its investment. The Pioneer Mining Company, formed by Lindeberg, Lindblom, and Brinteson, followed the same path. The 3 men, whose discovery began with pans and an open boat, became operators of one of the region's largest mining enterprises. In 1904, the company installed a steam shovel on Anvil Creek. Its bucket bit into banks that crews had previously attacked by hand, lifting gravel in loads no miner could carry. Water became machinery, too. The Miocene Ditch Company cut a tunnel through Anvil Mountain and built a system to deliver water to the claims under more than 300 feet of pressure. Large hydraulic nozzles directed the water against frozen banks and terraces. The stream struck with enough force to tear loose earth, gravel, and weathered bedrock. The resulting slurry ran toward sluice boxes, where the gold settled behind riffles while the lighter ground washed away. Hydraulic lifts moved material from places where gravity could not. In 1905, 3 of them were installed on Upper Anvil Creek. Contemporary observers described them as the largest machines yet seen there. The creek no longer looked like the place the 3 lucky Swedes had entered in 1898. Channels shifted. Banks disappeared. Tailings rose in pale ridges. Ditches carried water across slopes where no natural stream had flowed. Steam, falling water, metal buckets, and moving gravel replaced the quiet turning of a pan. The machines were not evidence that the gold had become richer. They were evidence that it had become harder to reach. Anvil Creek remained extraordinary. In 1900, it produced approximately $1,750,000 in gold, more than 1/3 of the entire Seward Peninsula's output that year. In 1901, Lindbergh reportedly recovered a nugget from the discovery claim that measured 6.5 inches across and weighed 6 pounds. Such nuggets made photographs and stories. The industry was moving in the opposite direction. Its future lay in particles too small and scattered for a lone miner to pursue. Profit came from processing enormous quantities of gravel, catching a little gold from each load, and repeating the operation without pause. The richest claims could be worked, reworked, and then worked again with better machinery. By 1905, the discovery claim had already been processed 3 times. Gravel on neighboring claims had been moved twice. Each pass altered the meaning of exhausted. To a man with a shovel, exhausted ground contained too little gold to pay for his food and time. To a company with pressurized water and mechanical excavation, the same ground might still contain a fortune. Later dredges would dig deeper into bedrock and recover gold left beneath earlier workings. Waste was simply ore waiting for a cheaper method. The beach attracted its own procession of inventors and promoters. Large machines were designed to recover fine gold from the shoreline and even from beneath the Bering Sea. Many failed. Salt water damaged equipment. Waves shifted foundations and buried machinery. Systems that performed well in drawings or demonstrations broke apart when exposed to surf, sand, and northern weather. Still, capital continued arriving because the scale of the district justified expensive mistakes. The transition changed work without eliminating workers. Men laid rail, drove steam shovels, maintained boilers, repaired pumps, cleared ditches, handled hydraulic nozzles, and fed sluices. But they increasingly did so for wages. The independent prospector remained part of Nome's image, walking alone with a pan and shovel. The gold leaving the district came increasingly from organized crews using equipment owned elsewhere. In 1906, gold production on the Seward Peninsula rose above $7 million, the highest annual output of the rush. The machines were extracting more wealth than ever. Along Front Street, there were fewer men left to spend it. In Nome, September began before the calendar said it did. By late summer, residents were already measuring food, fuel, and money against the ships still anchored offshore. Every vessel departing for Seattle removed another chance to leave before the Bering Sea closed. A person who waited for one more cleanup, one more payday, or one more favorable price for his equipment might discover that the final passage south had been sold. The rush had always contained a seasonal retreat. What changed after 1906 was the number of people who failed to return. Some followed new discoveries elsewhere in Alaska. Fairbanks offered another set of creeks, another collection of claim notices, and another city being built quickly enough to reward a person who arrived early. Others returned to occupations they had abandoned in the continental United States. A carpenter, cook, printer, or merchant did not need to admit that the gold had defeated him. He could simply say that Nome had become too expensive, too mechanized, or too settled to offer the old opportunity. The city lost population one steamship at a time. Rooms above Front Street remained empty longer. Restaurants removed tables. Saloons closed or combined with competitors. Equipment that could be sold went south. Equipment too heavy or worn to justify the freight charge remained beside the creeks. Canvas disappeared first. Wooden buildings lasted longer, their false fronts facing streets with fewer pedestrians. The federal census recorded 12,488 people in Nome in 1900. 10 years later, it counted 2,600. Some later summaries give the 1910 population as 3,200, but the federal figures preserve the lower number. Even using the higher estimate, the scale of departure is difficult to soften. A city large enough to fill 5 chairs in 1900 occupied barely one of them a decade later. The change was not hidden from people considering the journey. In May 1910, a labor newspaper published a warning from the Nome Miners Union and the local Western Federation of Miners. Unemployed workers were told to stay away. The rich mines, the notice said, were practically worked out. 12 years earlier, news of Nome had functioned as an invitation. Now the city was advertising the absence of work. Gold was still leaving the district. Large companies continued operating machinery, ditches, rail lines, and crews. But an industrial mine did not support a boomtown in the same way that thousands of independent prospectors did. A steam shovel required operators, mechanics, and laborers. It did not require 10,000 men buying shovels, meals, beds, whiskey, and passage. Production and population had separated. The buildings left behind faced dangers that had been present from the beginning. Most of Nome had been constructed quickly from imported lumber, placed close together on low ground beside an open sea. Fire could pass from roof to roof faster than water could be organized against it. In 1905, flames destroyed part of Front Street and more than 20 nearby cabins. Businesses rebuilt, but the new walls served a smaller city than the ones that burned. The Bering Sea removed buildings by another method. In October 1913, a severe storm drove waves across the shoreline and into the streets. Structures on the seaward side of Front Street were lifted from their foundations. Loose timbers, barrels, pieces of walls, and sections of roof became battering objects in the surf, striking whatever remained standing. Railroad cars were thrown into wreckage. Docks and warehouses broke apart. A temporary pontoon bridge had to be placed across the Snake River after the storm. Nearly every building along the south side of Front Street was damaged or destroyed. The East End and much of the business district lay under water and debris. A local newspaper later said, the city looked as though it had been shelled by a hostile fleet. The comparison was not far from what the photographs showed. Streets had become channels. Boardwalks ended in piles of lumber. Men and women climbed over the remains of stores whose signs were still attached to broken walls. The storm caused more than physical loss. A merchant who had rebuilt after fire, survived declining trade, and watched another gold season fail, now had to decide whether the same building deserved a third investment. Many residents left after the storm and did not return. Then the world beyond Nome created its own pressure. During the First World War, labor and capital shifted toward military service and wartime industries. Gold mining throughout Alaska contracted. Between 1916 and 1918, production at Nome fell by more than 2/3. Machinery stood idle. Men who might once have worked a placer claim could earn wages in shipyards, factories, or other mines closer to transportation. In the autumn of 1918, the ship Victoria carried influenza toward Nome. The disease reached the city's native village by the beginning of November. It moved through crowded homes and families with extraordinary speed. In 8 days, 162 native people died. More than 300 white residents also became ill. 25 of them died. Across western Alaska, entire communities lost parents, hunters, teachers, and children. Some villages approached complete destruction. The epidemic did not strike an empty landscape. It struck the people whose presence along the coast preceded the name Nome, the Gold Rush, and Front Street. By the time census takers counted the city in 1920, only 852 residents remained. Nome had fallen to less than 7% of its official population 20 years earlier. The number could have fit inside a few of the steamships that once waited offshore. Yet the city had not become a ghost town. Smoke still rose from chimneys in winter. The Nome Nugget continued printing. Stores opened. Children attended school. Dog teams moved along the frozen coast, and miners still worked ground that earlier machines had passed over. Nome remained the largest settlement on the Seward Peninsula, not because the rush had returned, but because the surrounding region still needed a port, trading center, hospital, post office, and connection to the outside. For those who stayed, isolation was no longer the price of reaching a fortune. It was the condition of ordinary life. Each autumn, the last ship departed. After that, whatever Nome had forgotten to order would have to wait until spring. In January of 1925, the most important objects in Nome were a few glass vials sitting on a hospital shelf. The label said diphtheria antitoxin. The date said expired. Dr. Curtis Welch had known the supply was too old to trust. Months earlier, he had ordered fresh serum for the 25-bed Maynard Columbus Hospital. But the shipment had not arrived before the last vessel left. Now the Bering Sea had closed behind a wall of ice, and the nearest useful medicine lay hundreds of miles away. Welch was the only doctor in Nome. At first, the sick children looked as though they had tonsillitis. Their throats hurt. Their voices weakened. Then came the gray membrane, thickening across the airway. 4 children died over the following weeks. In mid-January, Welch confirmed diphtheria in a 3-year-old boy. A 7-year-old girl died the next day. Mayor George Maynard called an emergency meeting. The city imposed a quarantine. Families were told to remain indoors. Schools and public buildings closed. More than 20 cases were confirmed, with at least 50 other people considered at risk. The memory of the influenza epidemic was only 6 years old. Nome knew how quickly sickness could move through crowded cabins, how little a locked door meant when several generations shared one stove and one room. Welch sent telegrams south. An epidemic was beginning at the edge of a frozen sea. A ship could not reach Nome. No road connected it to the rest of Alaska. Aircraft existed, but the available planes had open cockpits, engines that had not been tested in such cold, and equipment partly dismantled for the winter. Flying the medicine was discussed, then rejected. The railroad could carry the serum only as far as Nenana. From there, 674 miles of winter trail remained. A fresh supply was found in Anchorage and sent north by train. At Nenana, workers packed the glass vials in padding and placed them inside a metal cylinder. The package was small enough to hold beneath one arm. Ahead of it lay frozen rivers, timber country, coastal ice, mountain passes, and temperatures capable of turning exposed skin white within minutes. Shortly before midnight on January 27th, the first dog team left Nenana. The serum did not travel with one man. It moved through a chain of roughly 20 mushers and more than 150 dogs. Some were mail carriers who knew every bend in the trail. Several were Alaska Native men, whose names received little attention in newspapers farther south. Each team ran its portion, handed the cylinder forward, and disappeared behind it. The route operated like a living railroad. Dogs replaced locomotives. Roadhouses became stations. A mittened hand served as the coupling between one team and the next. Leonhard Sepala met the relay from the west, with Togo leading his team. They crossed Norton Sound, taking a route over sea ice that shortened the distance but placed moving water beneath their runners. Wind erased the trail as they traveled. At points, the ice buckled, cracked, and shifted beneath them. Sepala and Togo covered more than 250 miles during their outward journey and their part in the return relay, carrying the cylinder across the most dangerous stretch. Farther west, Gunnar Kassin took the package for the final approach. His lead dog was Balto. Snow drove sideways through the darkness. Kassin could barely see the dogs nearest the sled. At one point, a gust overturned the team and threw the cylinder into the snow. He searched with bare hands until he found it, then continued toward the lights of Nome. At 5:30 on the morning of February 2nd, Balto stopped on Front Street. The journey had taken 127.5 hours. Not one vial had broken. Newspapers turned Balto into a celebrity. A statue appeared in Central Park before the year was over. Togo and Sepala acquired their own legend more slowly. But the serum had reached Nome because no single figure owned the journey. A railroad crew, telegraph operators, doctors, roadhouse keepers, mushers, and dogs had formed a temporary piece of infrastructure across the interior of Alaska. The antitoxin helped contain the outbreak. Official accounts would never fully agree on the number of deaths, particularly beyond Nome, where records from native settlements were incomplete. What the city could measure was the narrowness of its escape. In summer, distance was counted in ship schedules. In winter, it was counted in dog teams. 9 years later, the same isolation returned in another form. On a September morning in 1934, an ember from a chimney landed on the roof of the Golden Gate Hotel. A 34-mile-an-hour wind carried the flames into Front Street. The fire moved faster than men could drag furniture from buildings. Roofs caught. Windows burst outward. Warehouses, saloons, garages, offices, and boarding houses burned in succession. The Nome Nugget staff tried to save its printing equipment, while the newsroom roof began to buckle. By midday, the fire had cut a path 10 blocks long and 3 blocks wide. 64 businesses and 90 homes were destroyed. 400 people were left without shelter. More dangerous still, the flames consumed much of the food stored for winter. The sea remained open, but not for long. Coast Guard vessels on Bering Sea Patrol shared their supplies. A ship carrying food came north from Seattle. Reindeer meat was redirected toward the city. Survivors ate in a community kitchen and slept in barracks, while lumber, roofing, flour, and fuel arrived before the freeze. Nome rebuilt with fewer buildings and wider spaces between them. Aircraft soon made the winter less absolute. Radio shortened the silence, yet each new connection carried the same quiet admission. The city could remain on that shore only if something crossed the distance. Beyond the rebuilt streets, dredges were already tearing through ground the stampeders had abandoned. And offshore, beneath water too cold for a shovel, the old beach deposit continued into the sea. The gold did not end at the waterline. The men working Nome Beach in 1899 could see only the strip exposed between the surf and the tundra. Beneath Norton Sound, the same geological work had been performed on older shores. During ancient pauses in the movement of the sea, waves sorted gravel at depths of roughly 36, 70, and 80 feet below the modern surface. Light sand moved on. Gold remained. Then the sea rose and covered the evidence. The beach had moved. The gold had not. For decades, miners worked inland instead. They thawed permafrost, blasted frozen gravel, and fed whole valleys into bucket dredges. The machines crawled across the country in ponds of their own making. Their steel buckets bit into earth at one end while processed stones poured from the other, leaving curved ridges across the tundra. There was always another layer to reach. Near Nome, an old beach might lie beneath 50 feet of frozen ground. The miners followed these buried shorelines as though tracing the outlines of vanished oceans. Eventually, attention turned toward the real one. Companies drilled thousands of holes into the floor of Norton Sound, searching for places where waves, streams, and glaciers had concentrated gold. The work was slow and expensive. A drill could prove that metal existed beneath one narrow point, without revealing whether enough lay between that point and the next to pay for lifting an entire seabed. In 1986, the largest answer yet appeared offshore. Its name was Bima. The dredge stood about 16 stories high, a floating factory visible from Front Street. A chain of enormous buckets descended from its hull, scraped the sea floor, and carried gravel upward. Inside, screens, jigs, and sluices separated heavy gold from lighter stone. The waste went back overboard, while the metal settled into the machinery. The Bima could process thousands of tons of seabed in a day. During its years off Nome, it recovered more than 100,000 ounces of gold, enough to fill several pickup trucks with metal. It still failed to make money. Operating a floating mine in Norton Sound meant feeding diesel engines, repairing machinery, paying large crews, and losing working days to wind and ice. The dredge could recover gold faster than any beach miner had imagined. It could also spend money faster. In 1990, the Bima stopped. Nome lost an operation estimated to have contributed millions of dollars each year to the local economy. The great vessel departed, leaving the submerged beaches where it had found them, disturbed but far from empty. What followed was smaller. Instead of a 16-story factory, some miners used boats assembled from fishing hulls, pontoons, steel plate, and whatever machinery could be shipped north. A gasoline or diesel engine powered a pump. A hose descended from the deck. At the bottom, a diver guided a suction nozzle across the gravel. The machine worked like an underwater vacuum cleaner. Seawater, sand, broken shells, and stones rushed up the hose and spilled into a sluice box on the vessel. The water escaped. The light material washed away. Dense grains collected behind strips of matting and metal riffles. The diver worked in darkness, thickened by his own labor. The moment the nozzle touched bottom, the water filled with sediment. He searched by feel, pulling aside rocks, following cracks, and listening to stones hammer through the hose beside his head. Warm water circulated through some diving suits, but Norton Sound remained close enough to the body to punish a failed pump or torn line quickly. From shore, the operation could look almost peaceful. A lowboat sat beyond the surf with an engine muttering on deck. Beneath it, a man held a machine against the bottom while the sea erased his view. In 2011, the state of Alaska offered offshore leases across nearly 24,000 acres. 83 tracts sold for just over $7 million. Some bidders paid more than $1,000 an acre for pieces of seabed they could not see. Television cameras arrived soon afterward. The series Bering Sea Gold turned Nome's offshore miners into recurring characters. Viewers watched dredges break, hoses clog, partnerships fracture, and sluice boxes open to reveal either yellow flakes or nearly nothing. The old language returned with new machinery. There were strikes, cleanups, pay dirt, and seasons lost before they had properly begun. The show brought another kind of stampeders. They arrived with welding equipment, diving suits, borrowed money, and confidence formed at a distance. The state of Alaska began warning prospective miners that Nome had no road connection, equipment was costly to transport, permits took time, and many operators would spend more than the value of the gold they recovered. 2 untrained offshore miners died. The beach gold of 1899 had required no claim. Offshore gold came divided into leases, mining claims, and public recreation areas. Yet there were no posts in the sea, no fences beneath the water, and no visible lines separating one man's ground from another's. Miners carried coordinates instead. The boundary existed as numbers on a screen. Gold without a fence had become gold behind an invisible one. Even winter no longer stopped everyone. On private claims and lease tracts, limited operations could work through the coldest months. Miners cut openings through the sea ice, lowered hoses into the black water, and sent divers beneath a frozen ceiling. Above them stood trucks, pumps, fuel drums, and shelters braced against the wind. Below them lay an ancient beach that had not seen daylight for thousands of years. Offshore mining never restored the city that had risen in 1900. It fed hardware stores, fuel sellers, mechanics, restaurants, and landlords. It placed working boats in the harbor and unfamiliar faces on Front Street. Some summers brought more dredges, others brought fewer. Gold prices rose, machinery failed, and Norton Sound continued to rearrange its floor. Along the modern beach, a person can still wash a pan of dark sand and find a bright speck at the bottom. Farther out, engines sound across the water. Hoses descend. Gravel rises through them. Beneath the boats are old stream channels, glacial stones, and shorelines from seas that no longer exist. Nome began when gold appeared beneath a man's boots. More than a century later, the gold is still there. Only the boots have left the ground.